Rolex represents luxury. Patek Philippe represents haute horlogerie. Seiko represents a major part of the Japanese watchmaking revolution. But there is another brand that managed to achieve something arguably even more difficult: to create watches that are extremely affordable, durable, accurate, and accessible to almost anyone on the planet. A brand capable of producing everything from one of the simplest and most recognizable watches in the world, the F-91W, to genuine machines built to withstand shocks, mud, water, and extreme conditions. That brand is Casio. And although many watch enthusiasts would never place a Casio alongside a Rolex, there is a surprisingly strong argument for considering Casio one of the best watch brands in the world. But to understand why, we have to go back to post-war Japan. Casio didn't even start by making watches. To understand how Casio eventually became one of the most important watch brands in the world, we first need to understand something fundamental. Casio wasn't even founded as a watch company. Its story begins in Japan just after World War II, in a country that needed to rebuild much of its economy and that, over the following decades, would become one of the greatest industrial and technological powers on the planet. And in the middle of that transformation was Tadao Casio. In 1946, he founded a small business called Casio Seisakujo, but at the time, it wasn't making watches. It wasn't even making calculators. One of its first commercially successful products was the Yubiwa pipe, a ring-like device that allowed people to hold a cigarette while smoking, leaving their hands free. It may seem completely irrelevant to this story, but the profits from that invention would help finance something far more ambitious. Because Tadao and his brothers were convinced that the future would be electronic. And then, they turned their attention to a machine that was beginning to transform offices around the world: the calculator. In 1957, they introduced the Casio 14A, an innovative, compact, fully electric relay-based calculator. During the 1960s, Japan began transforming at an extraordinary pace. Japanese electronics, automobiles, cameras, and semiconductors were beginning to conquer international markets. And Casio grew within this new technological Japan, developing calculators that became smaller, faster, and more accessible. For centuries, watches had relied on mainsprings, gears, escapements, and balance wheels to measure time. Then came quartz. By the late 1960s, electronics were beginning to prove that watches could be made dramatically more accurate. For many traditional watch companies, this represented a serious threat. For Casio, however, it was an opportunity. Because while other brands had to learn how to work with electronics, Casio had been born in the world of electronics. Casio enters the watch industry. In 1974, Casio finally decided to bring all of its expertise in electronics into completely new territory: watchmaking. And it did so by introducing the Casiotron, the company's first wristwatch. But Casio didn't simply want to make another digital watch. At the time, electronic watches were evolving rapidly, and different Japanese and American manufacturers were competing to see just how far this new technology could go. Casio decided to bring something it already understood perfectly from its experience with calculators: making electronics work for the user. The Casiotron displayed the hours, minutes, and seconds on an LCD screen. But it also included a remarkably advanced feature for the time: an automatic calendar capable of recognizing months with 28, 30, and 31 days. That may seem completely ordinary today, but in 1974, it perfectly demonstrated how Casio envisioned the future of the wristwatch. The watch that conquered the world, the Casio F-91W. But if there is one watch that represents Casio's philosophy better than any other, it probably isn't one of its most expensive or technologically advanced models. It is one of the simplest. The Casio F-91W, introduced in 1989, the F-91W was created as an affordable and functional digital watch. On paper, there was nothing particularly revolutionary about it. A small resin case, an LCD display, 3 buttons, and practically everything you need for everyday use: time, calendar, daily alarm, stopwatch, illumination, and water resistance. All of this powered by a quartz movement with more than enough accuracy for everyday use and a battery designed to last approximately 7 years. But perhaps one of the most surprising things about it is its size. The F-91W weighs barely 21 grams. It is so light that it practically disappears on the wrist. And then there is the price. Depending on the market, you can find one for around 20 or 30 euros. The watch Casio wanted to make indestructible G-Shock. If the F-91W proved that Casio could create a simple, affordable, and extremely reliable watch, G-Shock would show just how far the company could take that philosophy when durability became the absolute priority. The story begins with a Casio engineer named Kikuo. In the early 1980s, Ibi experienced a small accident that would ultimately change the history of the brand. A watch he cared about fell to the ground and broke. That led him to ask a very simple question. Why did a watch have to be so fragile? His idea was to create exactly the opposite. A watch capable of withstanding shocks, drops, and extremely demanding use without its owner having to constantly worry about damaging it. That idea gave birth to the famous Triple 10 concept. The original goal was to achieve approximately 10 years of battery life, 10 bar of water resistance, and the ability to survive a 10-meter drop. But achieving this proved far more difficult than it sounded. IB and his team, known as Team Tough, developed hundreds of prototypes while searching for a way to protect the electronic module from impacts. Simply building a thicker case wasn't enough. The real challenge was preventing the energy from an impact from being transferred directly to the internal components. Casio doesn't just make digital watches. Edifice. After the success of its digital watches, and especially G-Shock, Casio had already built a very clear identity: durability, technology, and functionality. But there was one problem. For millions of people, Casio was still simply the brand that made digital watches. And the company wanted to prove that its philosophy could also work in a much more traditional type of watch. That idea gave birth to Edifice, a collection introduced in the early 2000s and focused on analog watches with a much sportier and more elegant character. At first glance, an Edifice can look completely different from an F-91W or a G-Shock. Stainless steel cases, metal bracelets, more elaborate dials, chronographs, and designs clearly inspired by the world of motorsport. But underneath that appearance, we find exactly the same Casio DNA, using technology to make the watch more useful. Over the years, Edifice began incorporating some of the company's most characteristic technologies: tough solar power, time synchronization, advanced chronographs, and eventually Bluetooth connectivity with smartphones. The Casio, many watch enthusiasts don't know about, Oceanus. When we think of Casio, we probably imagine an F-91W costing just a few dozen euros, a rugged G-Shock, or perhaps an Edifice. But there is another side of Casio that many watch enthusiasts don't even know exists: Oceanus. Introduced in 2004, Oceanus was created as a much more premium collection, combining Casio's technological expertise with materials and finishing that we don't normally associate with the brand. And you only need to look at some of its models to realize that this is something completely different. Here we find watches made from titanium, sapphire crystals, much more refined cases, and dials with a level of detail far beyond what we usually see in conventional Casio watches. But Casio isn't trying to turn Oceanus into a traditional mechanical watch. Quite the opposite. Technology remains at the heart of everything. Many models use tough solar, allowing the battery to recharge using light, combined with radio-controlled time synchronization systems to maintain exceptional accuracy. More advanced models can also include Bluetooth connectivity, allowing them to connect to a smartphone to automatically adjust the time or manage different time zones. The Casio watches that defined generations. But perhaps one of the greatest demonstrations of Casio's importance isn't found in a single watch. It can be found in the enormous number of models that, in one way or another, have become part of popular culture. Because very few brands can claim to have created so many instantly recognizable watches. The F-91W is probably the best example. An extremely simple watch that has remained virtually unchanged for decades and continues to be one of Casio's most recognizable models. But it is far from alone. The A168 took that same philosophy and wrapped it in a metallic aesthetic that has now become a true symbol of retro style. Decades later, it still works, because the very thing that once looked outdated eventually became fashionable again. Then we have the CA53W, one of Casio's famous calculator watches. a watch that perfectly represents an era when having a calculator directly on your wrist almost seemed like science fiction. Its appearances in movies and television also helped turn it into a genuine technological icon. The real secret behind Casio. And this is where we begin to understand the real secret behind Casio. Casio doesn't try to compete with Rolex by making a better Rolex. Nor does it try to beat Patek Philippe by creating more complicated mechanical movements. Casio competes by its own rules. And those rules are built around 5 fundamental pillars: price, reliability, technology, durability, accessibility. One person can buy a Casio for just 20 euros. Someone else can buy a G-Shock for 150 euros. Another might choose an Edifice. Someone else might step up to an Oceanus. And a serious collector can spend thousands on an MR-G. Different watches, different customers, and completely different price points. But every single one of them carries the same name: Casio. Is Casio really one of the best watch brands in the world? But there is an obvious counter-argument. Casio barely competes in the world of mechanical watchmaking. It doesn't offer the craftsmanship of Grand Seiko. It doesn't have the prestige of Rolex. It doesn't produce haute horlogerie like Patek Philippe. And much of its catalog relies on relatively simple materials and construction. So how can we call Casio one of the best watch brands in the world? Because everything depends on how we define the word best. If we judge a watch brand exclusively by finishing, exclusivity, or mechanical complexity, then probably not. But if we consider something different, what you get for your money, reliability, innovation, durability, and cultural impact, then Casio has very few rivals. And now, I want to hear your opinion. Do you think Casio deserves to be considered one of the best watch brands in the world? And which Casio would you never want to be without in your collection? The legendary F-91W, a G-Shock, an Edifice, an Oceanus, or perhaps another model entirely? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey through the history of Casio, remember to leave a like, subscribe to Mundo Relojes, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. As always, thank you so much for being here, for supporting the channel, and for sharing this passion for watches. See you in the next video.